I really have never thought of myself seriously as a pilgrim. Either the Plymouth Rock kind, my family doesn't go back that far, or the kind who travels to shrines. That seems rather unseemly for a Protestant minister to do. So the fact that I have become a pilgrim of sorts is a bit of a surprise to me. As many of you know, as you've heard me say more than once, whenever we are in Brazil, Marcos and I always travel to the same shrine in a little town called Aparecida. Making pilgrimage there has become part of our summer vacation, a holy obligation, as our Catholic sisters and brothers call it. A reaching for something I can't quite explain, and quite frankly, I no longer feel the need to. It just is what it is. Perhaps some of you saw the article in the New York Times travel section a few weekends ago about the huge uptick in sacred pilgrimages. The author claims that 1 of every 3 tourists worldwide is a pilgrim. That means that 330 million people a year are on a trek to encounter something beyond themselves. He goes on to say, as if to prove his point, that for as long as we humans have been upright and able to walk, we've been walking toward God. As evidence, he points out that the Babylonians made pilgrimages, and so did the Greeks, the Israelites, the Chinese, the Mayans, etc., etc. Pilgrimage seems part and parcel of the religious impulse of the human creature. It seems more natural, I think, than sitting passively, like you all are doing, and receiving wisdom from on high. A pilgrimage actually asks you to get up off your behind and move into the unknown, and to do that with a receptive heart. Now that appeals to a lot of people in our world, those famous spiritual but not religious folks who really are not that interested in what experts have to say, but are very interested in what their experiences of life and the world and others can teach them. Today is Epiphany Sunday, the day we hear and celebrate the story of the wise men who went to pay homage to Jesus. We don't often think of them as pilgrims, but that is exactly what they were. They left the comforts of their homes and station and status in order to go on a spiritual quest. These mysterious wise ones have fascinated Christians since the earliest days. So much so that we have added details to the story, because really the Bible lesson that Pastor Emily just read for us all tells us very little about them, and only in the Gospel of Matthew are they even mentioned. Matthew simply reports that some wise ones from the east came to Jerusalem looking for a special child who was to be king. Oddly enough, they asked the current king where this child king was, and Herod, a Roman puppet, was none too pleased to hear about his replacement. The news actually frightened him, and because he was a toady and mean-spirited little man, that fear made him vicious. Maybe you know some people like that too. Apparently, King Herod wasn't particularly religious, so he had no idea what the scriptures say about where the Messiah was to be born, so he did what any non-religious king would do. He called his court, he called the scribes and the chief priests, and asked where he might find this usurper. In Bethlehem, they answered, for so it has been written by the prophets. Then Herod called these mysterious wise men back, and with what appeared to be newfound religious devotion, he said, "Do tell me where you find him, so that I too can go and pay him homage." So off they went. following the same star they had seen all the way back home until it seemed to stop in the sky. And there they found the house where Jesus and Mary were. No mention of Joseph, no mention of a manger, a different angle on the story. And they knelt in front of this child and presented him with the most elaborate gifts, unexpected gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And then they went home by another road because they had been warned in a dream to avoid the murderous Herod, and so they did. That's how Matthew tells the story. And as I said, it is without a lot of detail about who these people were. And so the church, as the church is wont to do, has added some detail. There's a very old tradition in the Western Church, of which we are a part, that claims that there were 3 of these characters based on the fact that there were 3 gifts. Matthew never says how many there were. And these 3 wise men had names and vocations and origins. Melchior was a Babylonian scholar. Who knew? Caspar was a Persian scholar. Balthasar was an Arab scholar. The Eastern Church has its own traditions and additions to this story. They say that there were actually 12 of these wise ones who rode across the desert on camels looking for Christ. And still other, smaller, but very interesting ancient Christian traditions say that there were up to 100 of these wise men who came looking for Jesus. I think that's based on the passage that David read earlier. So we know what Matthew says about them, and we know something of what the larger Christian tradition says about them, but what do the scholars say? Well, many of them believe that the wise men were actually members of a priestly caste of Zoroastrianism, an ancient monotheistic faith still practiced in the world today that comes out of Iran. And as Zoroastrian priests, it was their duty, it's what they did, to study the stars. They were astrologers. Astrology was a respected field of science at that time. And don't giggle, because 500 years from now, people will look back at us and say, they thought that was science. And as noted astrologers, they believed that a star was associated with each person's day of birth. And if there were an especially bright star that rose in a certain fashion in the sky, well, then that meant that a person of great importance had been born. So what is it that they saw? Well, nobody knows for sure, but some conjecture that maybe they saw a supernova or a comet. Whatever it was arresting enough, different enough, that they decided it must be followed. And so they set off on pilgrimage. I suppose that it is through generations of Christmas pageants with children dressed in bathrobes with towels on their heads that we have inadvertently domesticated this rather subversive tale. It's subversive because it is a story of the radical inclusiveness of what God is doing in the whole world in Jesus Christ. Consider this. If it is true that these men were Zoroastrian priests, then that means that the faithful ones, the lauded ones of this tale, are not the religious authorities in Jerusalem. Instead, the heroes of this tale are foreigners and pagans. Zoroastrianism might be monotheistic, but it has its own sacred text, its own claims to the truth, it would not have been recognized by the establishment in Jerusalem. And yet it was to these foreigners, these people without papers perhaps, these pagans, that Christ was revealed. And here's another interesting bit. They discovered Christ by using what they had and what they understood. They used their own tradition. They didn't discover the truth by studying the ancient Hebrew texts. They discovered the truth by studying the stars. They found God not by burying their faces in a book, but by lifting their heads upward, outward, looking out into the world. They found God in and through the natural world. And then, when they got to Jerusalem, they were not afraid to consult others from another religious tradition to help them unwrap the mystery. And it is worth noting that once they found the truth, and I think this part's very important, once they understood the truth, once they saw what God was doing in the world, they were willing to disobey the king in order to do the right thing, to protect human life and dignity. So these wise ones still teach. They teach us that God will speak through whomever God chooses, by whatever method God chooses. God will not be bound by the borders or fences or walls or protocols or doctrine or polity or political systems that we erect around the truth. The truth is in here, and you must come through this wall to get to it. No. All truth is God's truth. If it's true, it's God's. Second, nature declares the glory of God so profoundly that all people everywhere can find God through it. And lest you think I'm a heretic, let me quote St. Paul's letter to the Romans. Quote, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, God's eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made." And finally, they teach us that fidelity to God will sometimes mean active opposition to unjust powers and principalities in order especially to protect the vulnerable, those who cannot protect themselves. Well, that's all good stuff, if I do say so myself, but there is one more lesson in this tale. One more thing that I actually think might be more important, at least for us right now. As exotic as it seems to us to get on a camel and ride across a desert and follow a star, it wasn't exotic for the wise men at all. They were just living their lives. There was nothing extraordinary about it. It wasn't part of some pilgrimage vacation package. They were simply doing what they loved. As the Reverend Dr. Janet Hunt has written, they were simply living their lives to their natural conclusions. Studying the stars was in their blood. It's who they were. Which begs the question, who are you? What's in your blood? What makes your heart race? What keeps you up at night? What makes you excited? Perhaps the most wonderful part of this beloved tale is the most mundane. And it is simply this: you don't have to do anything out of the ordinary to find God. You just need to live your life with purpose to its natural conclusion. Whether you're in a classroom or a laboratory, in the concert hall, or scrubbing the floor, or walking your dog, or making jam, or playing with a child, or teaching children, or creating something beautiful on paper, or writing a program on your computer, whatever it is, you can find Christ in that. You can find Christ. They were just living their lives to their natural conclusions. That's what I like to do.